Hey Fellowship Kids team, Autumn here to talk to you about the lesson we'll be teaching in our kids classes this coming Sunday, October 20th. We are working our way through the Biggest Story curriculum, which is based on the Biggest Story Bible storybook. And this week we are in story 7. It's entitled Let's Make a Deal, and it's based on Genesis 15 and 17. Now, if you teach at our South Broadway location in our Curious Koalas class, or at North Metro in the Friendly Fish class, which are our toddler classes, then you are working your way through the curriculum with us, but we're providing a simplified lesson for you that is more appropriate for your age of students. And in this lesson, we suggest that you tell the story in one of two ways. You can either read the simplified version of the story that we've taken the Biggest Story Bible storybook and just scaled it down a little bit. So you can use that, or you can read the story from the Gospel Story Bible. We're trying each week to pick an alternative that is just written in a bit simpler, more straightforward language. Now, if you want to read the text that we wrote in your lesson, a great way to do that would be to use one of the posters that is in your classroom. One side has an illustration as a visual, and the other has the text from the Storybook Bible. You can simply stick your lesson up here and hold this up as a visual for your students, and then read the simplified version of the story from this side. So that would be a great way to use the resources and tell the story this week to your toddlers. If you are teaching in any of our older classes, so preschool and up, your lesson looks like this. It is just the printed version of the curriculum that goes along with the Biggest Story Bible storybook. Each week, the flow of the lessons starts out by saying the big picture. Now, the big picture is intended to help us recall where we've been already, so what we've learned in the weeks prior to this, and to help set the context so that we and our students know where in the storyline of Scripture this content is occurring and how it connects. After that big picture section, every week you'll see this. The curriculum suggests that you tell the story in one of three ways. Either read the Bible passage, read directly from the Biggest Story Bible storybook, or play the Biggest Story video. The video is based on the Biggest Story Bible storybook. There's someone in a very nice British accent reading the text from the storybook, and there's beautiful animation that goes along with it. Or you can use a couple of those modes. But after you tell the story, then the curriculum suggests that you teach the story, which is helping our students process and understand the scripture passage and the content. And then each week concludes with this gospel connection. And the gospel connection looks forward and helps us see how this story either points to Jesus or is fulfilled in Jesus. This week's lesson is based on Genesis 15 and 17. We already met Abram and Sarai, who are old. They don't have any children. And God showed up and told them to move and gave them a big promise. Let's remember the nature of this promise, which actually in our curriculum, in that big picture section, the curriculum is reminding us of as well. So the nature of the promise was twofold, the substance of the promise. God was going to give Abram a place, a land, and he was going to give Abram children. In fact, many children, many descendants who would be the recipients of a specific promise and would dwell in the promised land. And then God said, in addition to this place and this people, that through Abram's descendants, all the people, all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth would be blessed. This was a big promise. And where we pick up in today's story, in Genesis 15, it's been a little while since God made that promise to Abram. Abram's getting a little antsy, and he still doesn't quite see how he and his very old wife are going to have a son. They're still childless, and they're waiting for the fulfillment of this promise. And so in this passage, God shows up and reminds Abram that he has a plan and that he will fulfill his promise. The passage begins like this. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. And then Abram goes on to contest, but I'm still childless, so I guess one of my servants is going to inherit all my wealth. And then God pushes back and says, no. It says, the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. That verse that I just read, Genesis 15:6, is our memory verse for this month, and it is in the content of this week's lesson. So point that out to our students, make a big deal of it, but then also let's take a moment to understand what this verse is saying and how significant it is. It doesn't say Abram obeyed the Lord, it says Abram believed the Lord, and God credited that to him as righteousness. And then God reminds Abram of who he is and what he has done. Now, the content of this lesson is mostly based on Genesis 15. And there are a couple of tough things in the passage that's assigned for this week. In Genesis 15, there's this interesting, odd, obviously ancient and cultural ritual that Abram goes through with God, that God instructs him to walk through. And so Abram collects all these animals. Some of them are cut in half and laid out in a certain way. And then on what seems to be an indication that God, there's a blazing torch that passes between the pieces. Now, theologians, scholars say that this could be interpreted one of two ways. And in the section of the curriculum that says teach the story, the curriculum writers explain it, and they handle it in a way that I think is good. It helps us understand a difficult passage. It's accessible, it's understandable to us and to our students. So you can go ahead and just stick with how the lesson explains that ritual. And then at the end of that section, it points us towards Genesis 17. We're not going to really read much of Genesis 17 in class, and the lesson doesn't really rely on it, but all of chapter 17 talks about circumcision. It's not the main point of the lesson, but it is significant because circumcision is a theme that will come up again and again throughout Scripture. And so I do want you as a teacher to do a couple of things. Think about it this week, read a little bit about it. If you have a study Bible or you want to look up some resources, or if you want to ask me for some resources, please reach out. But be prepared for some questions. So again, this isn't what we're focusing on, but just be ready to answer questions from curious kiddos. I want to draw your attention to one particular aspect of this that will help us understand the significance of circumcision. There's so many facets of it that we could talk about, but it was a physical sign of God's covenant with Abram. Now, in the passage that's in between chapter 15 and chapter 17, we see that Abram and Sarai take matters into their own hands. They're tired of waiting, and Abram conceives a child with Hagar, who was Sarah's slave. So he uses his body to try to bring about God's promise. Now, God's promise was a son. It was a child. And a son is produced from that union, Abram and Hagar. But Abram tried to circumvent the way in which God said it would be accomplished. So then in chapter 17, we see God doing an interesting thing, giving Abram, who at this point becomes Abraham, giving Abraham and all of his descendants a visible sign of the way in which this covenant would be fulfilled. It would be through Abraham's seed and the successive seed of the generations after that. The promise was a child. It did require Abraham and then his successive generations, their very real physical contribution to the way God would bring about that promise. However, it was also a visible reminder that they could not do it apart from God's timing and God's method. Even though their bodies were to be used, their bodies were to be given in obedience and as a sacrifice, as an indication of belief in God's promise. And so the outward visible sign was a reminder of Abraham's sin, and then the way that God would bring about the covenant in spite of that, that he would continue to fulfill his promise to bring about his plan of redemption through their physical bodies, but in his way and in his time. All right, good luck as you prepare this interesting lesson. But I think our curriculum does an excellent job explaining it, and I'm excited that we get to teach it to our kids this week.